Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's weekly Intelligence Insights briefing. I'm Ross Hill, Director of Intelligence with At Risk's Global Risk Intelligence team, and I'm here with Roman Fisher and Cooper McGill. We're going to take you through some of the things that we found interesting or important for this week. The first one, there are several indicators of increasing risk of widespread social unrest. Primarily, they're coming from food and energy costs that I think most people are aware of have increased substantially over the last few months, but also because of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic itself, and then everything being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. But also, as well as these factors, we now have some increasing risks to the economy. Multiple central banks have increased interest rates to try and control inflation, and that's likely going to result in a reduction in cheap credit. It'll increase the cost of mortgages, loans, debt, things like that. Eventually, that should lower both demand and spending, and hopefully kind of bring down inflation, although it's going to be hanging around for some time. But as all of this happens, there is an expectation that a recession is coming. There's a really good recent IMF study on economics and social unrest, and that found also that significant bouts of unrest will also negatively impact the economy. According to that IMF study, on average, major unrest reduces GDP by around about 1%, 6 quarters after that unrest took place. So we're kind of reaching a potential situation where there's a risk that both the interest rate increases and then widespread unrest would lead to further economic hardship and then probably more unrest. And then from that, we'll see things like greater political polarization. And then you kind of get into a cycle of further unrest and violence. And then we have some other underlying factors like the protracted conflict in Ukraine, but also, very large debt to GDP ratios in some countries. And in some of those, they're higher now than they were kind of when we saw the worst impacts of the Great Recession that started about 2008, 2009. So you can see from the chart, particularly Greece, Italy, and Spain have higher debt to GDP ratios than they did back in 2014. So we're in for quite a difficult time where governments are trying to recoup money they spent to stabilize economies and fight the COVID-19 pandemic, but they're going to start receiving less income because of reduced economic activity. So we need to start looking at some of the indicators of instability. So how much it costs countries to borrow money is an important one. The yield on Italy's 10-year sovereign bonds went over 4% recently. During the financial crisis, anything over about 7% was considered unserviceable. We also need to take a look at government budget and spending cuts and tax increases. And one, and then the important thing is, where is this going to happen, or where are we going to see particular issues? So the IMF research found that countries that have in the past experienced large-scale unrest, or where there is large-scale unrest in neighbouring countries, that's a really important variable for predicting future unrest. So, the history of unrest is another important factor in identifying where might be most at risk. And what does this mean for companies? Well, we're likely to see a more unstable operating environment. And then something we've talked about a lot, the increased scrutiny of executive and companies' statements of behaviour. And then all of these things will increase the risk of strikes, protest boycotts, insider threat, that kind of thing. And now to talk about social unrest further, I'll hand you over to Roman Fisher.
Thank you, Ross. Kind of backing up what you were saying, over the weekend, thousands protested in Washington, D.C. and London over economic inequality and, to a certain extent, poor governance. In London, thousands marched through the central part of the city in order to protest over the soaring cost of living in the UK. Huge crowds flooded into the capital and rallied to demand that the government do more to help people faced with the cost of living and the wages not matching that rising cost. The Trade Union Congress, or TUC, which is an umbrella organization for labor unions which organized the protest, said that its research suggests workers have effectively lost a total of 20,000 pounds, or just over 24,000 US dollars since 2008, because pay has not kept pace with inflation. Additionally, the TUC warns strikes will spread across the UK. In DC, thousands of protesters gathered in the Capitol to demand change because of what they consider a government that is increasingly distancing itself from the reality of US citizens. On Saturday, protesters participated in what they call a morale march for the cause titled Assembly of the Working Poor and Low-Income Workers. The group is a civil rights movement created by Martin Luther King in the late 60s, and then was restarted again in 2017 by Reverend William Barber. Lastly today, the participants included labor unions, essential workers, veterans, social workers, and activists. Protesters claim that they represent a nation that continues to pay for the corruption of the political class and the system that governs it. Now moving on to close us out this morning with Cooper McGill.
An update this week in the unionization movement. Apple workers over the weekend on Saturday, June 18th, voted to unionize. These are workers at a Baltimore area location. They voted 65 to 33 in favor of unionization. Throughout this movement, Apple was frequently accused of union busting tactics, trying to utilize pressure to try and convince employees to change their minds on unionization. This led to a lot of negative sentiment directed toward both Apple and toward its key executives online and on social media. This fits into a broader unionization trend that we have talked about before, with efforts also at Starbucks, Amazon, REI, just to name a few. Between October 2021 and March of this year, we've seen almost a 60% rise in union representation petitions, according to the NLRB. So this really is not just efforts that are happening to grab the headlines. There is a measured increase in these movements. One of these reasons being an abundance of jobs relative to the available workforce. Back in April, at least, there were nearly 2 available jobs for every unemployed individual. So given this, and given some of the other economic factors and social factors that Ross and Roman both mentioned, it's likely this trend is going to continue for the foreseeable future. So that is something we're going to want to continue to track, particularly as it pertains to sentiment toward corporations and their executives and any risks that might arise out of that. And that is all we have for you this week. We appreciate you checking in and hope you found some of the information useful, and we will be back again next week. Thank you.